Welcome to this journey through one of the most chilling cases in Kentucky's history. A tale so disturbing that even hardened investigators struggled to comprehend its depths. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will haunt you in a way few other accounts can, challenging everything you thought you knew about trust, marriage, and the darkness that can hide behind the most ordinary faces. We're about to delve into a mystery that spanned nearly 3 decades, where a woman defied all expectations of feminine virtue and left a legacy so horrifying that many in her community still refuse to speak her name. This is the story of how death followed one woman like a shadow, how husbands disappeared into the earth itself, and how justice arrived far too late for those who screamed from beneath the ground. It was the year 1947. The Second World War had ended just 2 years prior, and America was transforming. Cities swelled with returning soldiers. Factories converted from war production to consumer goods. The suburbs began their sprawl across the countryside. But in the remote hills of eastern Kentucky, in places where coal dust still settled on everything, and where families had lived in the same hollows for generations, life moved at a different pace. Time seemed to stand still in these mountain communities, where traditions ran deeper than the coal seams, and where some secrets remained buried for decades. In Harlan County, Kentucky, the situation was particularly isolated. This was coal country, where black lung disease killed as reliably as mine collapses, where poverty was as endemic as the morning fog that draped itself across the mountains. The county had earned the nickname Bloody Harlan during the labor wars of the 1930s, when coal companies and union organizers had turned these hills into a battlefield. By the late 1940s, an uneasy peace had settled over the region, but violence still simmered just beneath the surface, woven into the fabric of daily life in ways outsiders could never fully understand. There, between mist-covered peaks and deep valleys where the sun barely penetrated for months at a time, communities lived virtually isolated from the rest of the world, connected only by dirt roads that became impassable rivers of mud during the endless months of rain. The mountains themselves seemed alive, ancient sentinels that had witnessed generations of human struggle and suffering, their slopes covered in dense forests where it was easy to lose your way, where someone could disappear entirely and never be found. The towns were small, grim collections of wooden structures that seemed to sag under the weight of accumulated hardship. Company stores dominated the centers, painted in fading colors, their windows displaying goods that most miners could never afford after the company deducted their debts. Churches stood on nearly every corner, their white paint peeling, their bells calling the faithful to services where preachers warned of hellfire and damnation, never imagining that true evil might sit among their congregations, singing hymns with a voice as sweet as honey. In one of these forgotten communities, in a hollow so narrow that neighbors could hear each other's conversations through thin cabin walls, lived a woman named Nellie Mae Patterson. To those who knew her casually, she seemed unremarkable. She was neither beautiful nor plain, neither tall nor short, neither particularly charming nor notably unpleasant. She existed in that peculiar middle ground of human appearance that made her almost invisible, the kind of woman who could walk through a room and be forgotten 5 minutes later. But those who knew her better, who had looked into those pale blue eyes that seemed to hold no warmth, who had noticed how her smile never quite reached those eyes, understood that something was fundamentally wrong with Nellie Mae Patterson, something missing, some essential piece of humanity that most people carried within them had simply never developed in her, leaving behind a void where empathy should have existed. She had been born in 1915, the youngest daughter of a coal miner who drank away his wages and a mother who had died giving birth to her 8th child. Nellie Mae grew up in poverty so extreme that it had shaped her in fundamental ways, twisting her understanding of human relationships into something transactional, something cold. She learned early that survival required ruthlessness, that sentiment was a luxury she couldn't afford, that other people existed primarily as resources to be exploited. By the time she reached 16, she was already working in a boarding house, cleaning rooms and serving meals to minors who paid her more attention than she wanted. She developed a skill for manipulation, for reading what men wanted and showing them just enough to keep them interested, never enough to satisfy. She learned to smile at the right moments, to lower her eyes demurely, to project an image of innocence that made men want to protect her, to save her from the hardships of mountain life. Her first husband was named Thomas Webb. She married him in 1933, when she was 18 years old and he was 26. Thomas worked in the mines, as did every able-bodied man in the hollow. He was kind to her, according to those who knew them, perhaps too kind. He gave her most of his wages, worked double shifts to buy her small luxuries, believed every word that fell from her lips like gospel truth. He loved her with the desperate intensity of a lonely man who had finally found someone to care for, never realizing that the woman he married was incapable of returning that love. For 2 years, they lived together in a small cabin on the edge of the hollow. Neighbors reported that Thomas seemed happy, that he talked about starting a family, about building a better house once he'd saved enough money. Nellie Mae, by all accounts, seemed content enough, playing the role of dutiful wife with reasonable skill, though some of the older women in the community noticed something off about her, something they couldn't quite articulate, but that made them uneasy. It was in the spring of 1935 that Thomas Webb disappeared. He left for his shift at the mine one morning before dawn, his lunch pail in hand, and simply never arrived. The mine foreman reported him absent. His fellow miners confirmed he'd never shown up. A search was organized, men combing the paths between the Webb cabin and the mine entrance, looking for signs of where Thomas might have gone. They found nothing, no body, no blood, no indication of what had happened to him. It was as if the mountains had simply swallowed him whole, as they had swallowed so many others over the years. Mining communities were accustomed to death, to men who went into the earth and never came back out. But those deaths happened in the mines themselves, in cave-ins and explosions and gas leaks. For a man to disappear on the way to work was unusual, troubling. Nellie Mae's reaction was also unusual. She grieved, certainly, but in a perfunctory way that struck some observers as rehearsed. She wore black for the appropriate amount of time. She accepted condolences with downcast eyes and murmured thanks. She collected the small amount of money that Thomas had managed to save, money that had been intended for their future together. And then, after only 3 months of widowhood, she began receiving visits from another miner named Harlan Patterson. The courtship was brief. Nellie Mae seemed eager to remarry, explaining to anyone who asked that a woman alone in these mountains faced too many hardships, that she needed the protection and provision of a husband. Harlan Patterson was older than Thomas had been, 40, to Nellie Mae's 20, and he had some money saved. He owned his cabin outright, having inherited it from his parents. He was steady, reliable, the kind of man who paid his debts and kept his word. They married in August of 1935, just 5 months after Thomas Webb had vanished. If anyone found this indecent, if anyone questioned whether Nellie Mae had mourned her first husband adequately, they kept such thoughts to themselves. Judgment was one thing, but interfering in another person's marriage was quite another, and mountain people generally believed in minding their own business, even when that business included matters that didn't quite sit right. Harold Patterson seemed happy enough at first. He provided well for his new wife, better than Thomas had been able to. He bought her new dresses, had glass windows installed in the cabin to replace the oiled paper that had covered the openings. He talked about his good fortune in finding such a young wife, how she made his house a home, how the loneliness that had plagued him for years had finally ended. But after a year, neighbors began to notice changes. Harold became withdrawn, less talkative. He developed a nervous habit of looking over his shoulder, of starting at sudden sounds. When asked if everything was well, he would force a smile and change the subject. His fellow miners noticed that he seemed tired, that he was losing weight, that he had developed a persistent cough that wouldn't go away despite multiple visits to the company doctor. In the late summer of 1937, Harold Patterson became seriously ill. What started as that persistent cough evolved into something more severe, leaving him bedridden and weak. Nellie Mae cared for him, bringing him food and water, administering the medicines the doctor prescribed, sitting by his bedside for hours at a time. To all outward appearances, she was a devoted wife tending to her ailing husband with admirable dedication. Harold died in early September, his body racked with convulsions in his final hours, his face contorted in what witnesses described as unimaginable agony. The doctor, when he finally arrived, attributed the death to pneumonia complicated by years of breathing coal dust. It was a common enough diagnosis in mining country, where respiratory diseases killed more men than accidents. Harold Patterson was buried in the small cemetery on the hillside above the hollow, his grave marked with a simple wooden cross that would rot away within a few years. Nellie Mae inherited everything, the cabin, Harold's savings, which were substantial compared to what most miners managed to accumulate. His possessions. She wore black again, grieved again in that same perfunctory way that had characterized her mourning for Thomas Webb. And once again, after what was considered a minimally appropriate period of mourning, she began receiving visits from another man. This third husband was named Raymond Clark. He was 50, 3 years old when he married Nellie Mae Patterson in the spring of 1938, making him more than twice her age. Raymond had lost his wife to tuberculosis 3 years earlier and had been living alone since then, struggling to maintain his household while working in the mines. Nellie Mae presented herself as the solution to his problems, a young woman willing to care for an older man, to bring life back into his empty house. Raymond's family was immediately suspicious. His daughter, a woman in her late 20s named Margaret, had never liked Nellie Mae, had heard the whispered rumors that circulated through the community about the Black Widow, as some had begun to call her in private. Margaret argued with her father, begged him not to marry this woman who had already buried 2 husbands under mysterious circumstances. But Raymond was lonely, and loneliness makes people vulnerable to manipulation in ways that logic cannot overcome. The marriage lasted less than a year. Raymond, like Harold before him, developed a mysterious illness that left him bedridden and suffering. He complained of terrible stomach pains, of a burning sensation in his throat, of weakness so profound that he could barely lift his head from the pillow. Nellie Mae tended to him faithfully, keeping visitors away by claiming that he needed rest, that too much excitement would worsen his condition. Margaret Clark managed to visit her father only twice during his final illness, and both times she found him in a state that alarmed her deeply. He seemed terrified of something, though he wouldn't or couldn't explain what. His eyes followed Nellie Mae around the room with an expression that Margaret later described as pure fear. When Margaret tried to speak with him alone, Nellie Mae refused to leave the room, citing her duty as a wife to remain by her husband's side. Raymond Clark died in February of 1930. 9. His death as agonizing as Harold Patterson's had been. The doctor once again attributed it to natural causes, though Margaret demanded an investigation. The local sheriff, a man named William Hargrove, interviewed Nellie Mae and examined Raymond's body. He found nothing obviously suspicious, no evidence of foul play that would justify further investigation. The death was ruled natural, and Raymond was buried next to his first wife in the hillside cemetery. But Margaret Clark wouldn't let it rest. She began asking questions throughout the community, talking to anyone who had known Thomas Webb and Harold Patterson, documenting the pattern that seemed so obvious to her but that others preferred to ignore. She discovered that both of Thomas Webb's brothers had died young under mysterious circumstances. She learned that Harold Patterson's first wife had also died unexpectedly, though that had been years before Harold married Nellie Mae. She compiled a list of suspicious deaths connected, however tangentially, to the woman her father had married. Sheriff Hargrove was skeptical. Margaret's evidence was circumstantial at best, consisting largely of coincidence and innuendo. Men died all the time in coal country, disease was rampant, accidents were common. The fact that Nellie Mae Patterson had buried 3 husbands didn't necessarily mean she had killed them. Without concrete evidence, without witnesses, without bodies that showed clear signs of murder, there was nothing he could do. And so life continued in the hollow. Nellie Mae remained in Raymond Clark's house, living comfortably on the money she had inherited from her 3 husbands. She was only 20, 4 years old, and already a wealthy woman by the standards of the community. Some said she would remarry again, that she would continue her pattern of marrying and burying until someone finally stopped her. Others argued that she had enough money now, that she didn't need another husband. Both groups were wrong. For the next 8 years, Nellie Mae lived alone. She kept to herself, rarely attending church services or community gatherings. She maintained Raymond Clark's house meticulously, painted it, repaired the roof, installed new furniture. She seemed content with her solitude, or perhaps she had simply learned that her pattern had become too obvious, that another dead husband would finally push the community beyond skepticism into action. Then, in 1947, she met James Patterson, no relation to Harold Patterson, despite sharing a surname. James was a widower, 61 years old, who had moved to Harlan County from Virginia to be closer to his sister. He was kind, gentle, devoutly religious, the sort of man who saw the good in everyone and refused to believe in human evil. When he met Nellie Mae Patterson at a church social, he saw a lonely widow who needed companionship, not a predator who had already claimed at least 3 lives. They married in June of 1947. James moved into Nellie Mae's house, bringing with him his modest possessions and his considerable savings from a lifetime of careful frugality. His sister, Elizabeth, was disturbed by the marriage, had heard the rumors about Nellie Mae even though she'd only recently moved to the area. She tried to warn her brother, but James dismissed her concerns as gossip and superstition. For a few months, James seemed happy. He wrote letters to friends in Virginia describing his new life, his new wife, his contentment. He attended church regularly, often alone because Nellie Mae claimed various ailments that prevented her from accompanying him. He was friendly with the neighbors, waving and calling out greetings, maintaining the cheerful demeanor that had characterized him throughout his life. The change began in October. James became quieter, more withdrawn. He stopped attending church. When Elizabeth visited, she found him pale and weak, complaining of stomach problems that had persisted for weeks. Nellie Mae explained that he had a sensitive stomach, that she was feeding him bland foods and keeping him comfortable. The doctor had been by, she said, and had prescribed rest and a simple diet. Elizabeth didn't believe her. She had seen this pattern before, had heard about how Harold Patterson and Raymond Clark had suffered before their deaths. She went directly to Sheriff Hargrove and demanded that he investigate. This time, the sheriff listened. Margaret Clark had continued her own investigation over the years, had compiled an even more detailed account of deaths connected to Nellie Mae Patterson. Combined with Elizabeth's testimony and James Patterson's obvious illness, there was finally enough evidence to warrant action. Sheriff Hargrove visited the Patterson house on a cold morning in late October. He found James in bed, barely conscious, his breathing shallow and labored. The room smelled of sickness and something else, something chemical that Hargrove couldn't quite identify. When he questioned Nellie Mae, she remained calm, almost unnaturally so, explaining that her husband was simply ill, that old age was catching up with him. Hargrove made a decision that would finally break the case open. He arranged for James Patterson to be removed from the house immediately and taken to the hospital in the county seat, over Nellie Mae's vehement protests. She claimed they were kidnapping her husband, that this was an abuse of authority, that she would sue everyone involved. But Hargrove had the law on his side and, more importantly, a growing certainty that if he left James Patterson in that house, the man would be dead within days. At the hospital, doctors began treating James Patterson for what they quickly recognized as poisoning. His symptoms were consistent with arsenic exposure, though the amount in his system suggested a slow, deliberate dosing over an extended period. With treatment, James began to recover, slowly regaining strength and lucidity. When he was finally able to speak coherently, he told a story that horrified everyone who heard it. Nellie Mae had been poisoning him. She had been putting something in his food, in his water, in the medicines she claimed the doctor had prescribed. He had suspected for weeks, but had been too weak to resist, too confused to act. He described how she would watch him eat, her eyes cold and patient, waiting for the poison to do its work. He recounted nights when he had heard her moving around the house in the darkness, the sound of digging from somewhere outside, though he had been too ill to investigate. Sheriff Hargrove obtained a warrant to search the Patterson property. What they found in the backyard would become one of the most notorious discoveries in Kentucky's criminal history. Behind the house, in an area that Nellie Mae had always kept fenced off, claiming she was growing vegetables, the investigators found disturbed earth. Lots of disturbed earth. When they began to dig, they discovered why. The first body they found was Thomas Webb, or what remained of him after 12 years in the ground. He had been buried in a shallow grave, his body contorted in a position that suggested he had been alive when placed in the earth. Soil was found in his lungs, in his mouth, evidence that he had breathed it in, that he had suffocated slowly while buried. The horror of his death was evident even after more than a decade of decomposition. Harold Patterson was found next, and then Raymond Clark. Both showed the same signs of having been buried alive. Harold's fingers were worn to the bone, suggesting he had tried to claw his way out of his grave. Raymond's skull showed fractures consistent with being struck repeatedly before burial, though not hard enough to kill him immediately. They had both died in agony, suffocated by the earth that pressed down on them, aware of what was happening but unable to escape. But the most disturbing discoveries were yet to come. As the excavation continued, investigators found 4 more bodies. 2 were identified as the brothers of Thomas Webb, both of whom had supposedly died in mining accidents years before Nellie Mae had married Thomas. Another was identified as Harold Patterson's first wife, who everyone had believed died of natural causes in 1933. The fourth body was never positively identified, though it appeared to be that of an adult male who had been buried for at least 20 years. 7 bodies. 7 people who had died at Nellie Mae Patterson's hands, buried in her backyard like refuse, their deaths covered up through a combination of remote location, community reluctance to investigate, and sheer audacity. The scope of her crimes was staggering, the cruelty incomprehensible. She had been killing for at least 15 years, possibly longer, and no one had stopped her. Nellie Mae Patterson was arrested on October 28, 1947. She showed no emotion as Sheriff Hargrove read the charges, 7 counts of murder. She didn't resist, didn't protest her innocence, didn't ask for a lawyer. She simply stared at him with those pale blue eyes that held no warmth, no remorse, no recognition that she had done anything wrong. The trial began in January of 1948, and it became a sensation. Reporters from across Kentucky descended on Harlan County, filling the small courthouse to capacity. Photographers captured images of Nellie Mae sitting calmly at the defense table, her expression blank, her hands folded in her lap. She looked so ordinary, so unremarkable, that spectators struggled to reconcile her appearance with the monstrous acts she was accused of committing. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They presented testimony from James Patterson, who described his poisoning in detail. They brought in medical experts who explained how arsenic could be administered gradually, causing slow deterioration that mimicked natural illness. They showed photographs of the bodies, of the backyard excavation, of the evidence of live burial. They called Margaret Clark and Elizabeth Patterson to testify about their suspicions, their attempts to save their family members, their frustration at not being believed. The defense had little to work with. Nellie Mae's attorney, a court-appointed lawyer who seemed overwhelmed by the magnitude of the case, attempted to argue that the evidence was circumstantial, that the bodies could have been buried by someone else, that Nellie Mae was being scapegoated for deaths that had natural causes. It was a weak defense, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. On the 4th day of the trial, something unexpected happened. Nellie Mae Patterson requested permission to address the court. Against her attorney's advice, she took the stand. What followed was one of the most chilling testimonies in American criminal history. She confessed to everything, not with remorse or guilt, but with a matter-of-fact tone that suggested she was describing something no more significant than her daily household routine. She explained how she had married Thomas Webb for his money, how disappointed she had been to discover he had very little saved. She described poisoning him gradually with rat poison, then convincing him to help her dig what she claimed was a root cellar in the backyard. When the hole was deep enough, she had struck him with a shovel, knocking him unconscious, then rolled him into the pit and began filling it in. According to her own testimony, Thomas regained consciousness while being buried. She described hearing his muffled screams, seeing his hands break through the surface of the soil, grasping at air. She had calmly continued shoveling dirt until the hands stopped moving, until the screaming stopped, until there was nothing but silence and freshly turned earth. She recounted similar details for each of her victims, describing their murders with a clinical detachment that made spectators physically ill. Some people left the courtroom unable to listen further. Others stayed, transfixed by the evil that sat before them wearing a woman's face and speaking in a woman's voice. When asked why she had done it, Nellie Mae's answer was simple: money. She had killed 7 people for their savings, for their property, for whatever modest wealth they had accumulated. She showed no understanding that what she had done was morally wrong, only that it had been illegal. When the prosecutor asked if she felt any remorse, she seemed genuinely puzzled by the question, as if he had asked her whether she regretted eating breakfast that morning. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. They found Nellie Mae Patterson guilty on all 7 counts of first-degree murder. The judge, his voice shaking with anger, sentenced her to death by electric chair. Kentucky had recently reinstated capital punishment after a brief moratorium, and Nellie Mae Patterson would be one of the first people executed under the new law. Nellie Mae spent 14 months on death row at the Kentucky State Penitentiary in Eddyville. During that time, she gave several interviews to psychiatrists and criminologists who were fascinated by her complete lack of empathy, her inability to understand why people were so upset about her actions. She became a case study in psychopathy, an example of how someone could exist in human society while lacking all the essential characteristics that define humanity. She never showed remorse. She never asked for forgiveness from the families of her victims. She never expressed any emotion beyond mild irritation at being inconvenienced by her imprisonment. She ate her meals, slept soundly, and waited for her execution with the same blank detachment that had characterized her entire adult life. The execution was scheduled for March 15, 1949. On that morning, Nellie Mae Patterson was led from her cell to the death chamber. She walked calmly, her footsteps echoing in the corridor, her face showing no fear. When offered a chance to make a final statement, she declined. When asked if she wanted a minister to pray with her, she said no. She was strapped into the electric chair at 8 o'clock in the morning. The witnesses included representatives from the families of her victims, law enforcement officials, and reporters. The warden read the death warrant, his voice formal and somber. The executioner waited for the signal. Nellie Mae Patterson's last moments were unremarkable. She didn't cry out. She didn't pray. She didn't show any sign of fear or regret. When the current hit her body, she jerked violently against the restraints, her fingers clenching, her jaw tightening. The smell of burning flesh filled the chamber. After 3 charges of electricity, the doctor confirmed her death. She was 34 years old. In the aftermath of her execution, the community of Harlan County struggled to understand how such evil could have existed among them for so long. How had Nellie Mae managed to kill 7 people over nearly 2 decades without being caught? Why had suspicions been dismissed? Why had warnings been ignored? Part of the answer lay in the isolation of mountain communities, where official oversight was minimal and where people generally handled their own affairs without outside interference. Part lay in the reluctance of people to believe that a woman could be capable of such calculated violence. Part lay in simple human nature, the tendency to explain away uncomfortable facts rather than confront difficult truths. The house where Nellie Mae had lived was torn down within a year of her execution. No one wanted to live there, not after what had been discovered in the backyard. The land remained empty for decades, gradually being reclaimed by the forest, until eventually even the foundation stones disappeared beneath layers of leaves and undergrowth. The 7 victims were all reburied in proper graves with proper markers. Thomas Webb, Harold Patterson, Raymond Clark, and the others finally received the dignity in death that had been denied to them when they were murdered. Their families held memorial services, trying to find some measure of closure, though the manner of their deaths made that closure nearly impossible to achieve. James Patterson recovered from his poisoning and lived another 18 years. He moved back to Virginia, unable to remain in the place where he had nearly died, where his wife had tried to bury him alive like she had buried so many others. He rarely spoke about his experience, but those close to him said he suffered from nightmares for the rest of his life, dreams in which he felt soil filling his mouth and darkness closing in around him. Margaret Clark, who had fought so hard to expose Nellie Mae Patterson, never forgave herself for not doing more to stop her earlier. She blamed herself for her father's death, convinced that if she had been more persistent, more aggressive in her accusations, Raymond Clark might have lived. She carried that guilt until her own death in 1973. Sheriff William Hargrove retired shortly after Nellie Mae's execution. The case had taken a toll on him, not just the horror of what he had discovered in that backyard, but the knowledge that he could have acted sooner if he had trusted his instincts instead of demanding concrete evidence. He spent his retirement years advocating for better training for rural law enforcement, for resources that would help small departments investigate suspected crimes more effectively. The story of Nellie Mae Patterson remains a disturbing reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. It doesn't always wear a monstrous face or speak in a monstrous voice. Sometimes it looks ordinary. Sometimes it seems harmless. Sometimes it lives next door for years before anyone realizes what they're living next to. Her case challenged assumptions about gender and violence that were prevalent in the 1940s and that, to some extent, persist even today. The idea of a female serial killer seemed almost impossible to many people at the time. Women were supposed to be nurturers, caregivers, the gentler sex. The reality that a woman could methodically murder 7 people, bury them alive in some cases, and feel no remorse whatsoever, contradicted fundamental beliefs about human nature and gender roles. Psychologists who studied Nellie Mae's case identified her as one of the clearest examples of psychopathy they had ever encountered. She displayed all the classic characteristics: lack of empathy, inability to form genuine emotional bonds, superficial charm used for manipulation, complete absence of guilt or remorse, view of other people as objects to be used rather than individuals with their own inherent worth. She was, in clinical terms, a predator disguised in human form. But questions remain, mysteries that were never fully answered even after her confession and execution. Who was the unidentified body found in her backyard, the one that had been there for at least 20 years? Had Nellie Mae been killing even before she married Thomas Webb? Were there other victims, buried in other locations, that were never discovered? Did she act alone, or had she had accomplices at any point in her murderous career? The broader question, the one that haunts anyone who studies this case, is more philosophical. How do we recognize evil when it doesn't conform to our expectations? How do we protect potential victims when the perpetrator seems so ordinary, so unremarkable, so fundamentally unthreatening? Nellie Mae Patterson succeeded for as long as she did because she understood how to exploit people's assumptions and biases, how to present herself as a victim of circumstance rather than a calculating predator. To this day, in the hollows of Harlan County, older residents still remember the Black Widow case. They remember the shock that rippled through the community when the bodies were discovered, the horror of realizing that someone they had known, someone they had seen at the store and at church functions, had been a monster. Some of them still feel guilty for not recognizing the signs earlier, for not listening to Margaret Clark's warnings, for not demanding a more thorough investigation when the first husband disappeared. The land where Nellie Mae Patterson's house once stood remains empty. Local teenagers sometimes venture there on dares, testing their courage by walking through what they call the Black Widow's graveyard. They report feeling watched, feeling a presence that makes the hair on their necks stand up. Whether this is genuine supernatural phenomenon or simply the power of suggestion, the fear that the location provokes is real enough. And on quiet nights, when the wind moves through the mountains carrying whispers of the past, when the moon illuminates the hollow where 7 people died in terror and agony, some claim they can't still hear sounds coming from that empty land, the sound of digging, the sound of muffled screams, the sound of soil being shoveled onto something that's trying desperately to escape. Whether these sounds are real or imagined, whether they're echoes of past horror or simply the mountain itself remembering what happened on its slopes, they serve as a reminder that evil can wear the most ordinary face, that trust can be weaponized, that monsters don't always announce themselves, that sometimes the greatest danger comes from the person who seems least dangerous. Nellie Mae Patterson killed at least 7 people that we know of, possibly more that we'll never know about. She destroyed families, traumatized a community, and died without ever understanding why what she had done was wrong. She represents one of the darkest chapters in Kentucky's history, a chapter that the state would prefer to forget, but that must be remembered. Because forgetting enables repetition. Forgetting means we don't learn from the past. Forgetting means that the next Nellie Mae Patterson might succeed for even longer, might claim even more victims, because we've allowed ourselves to believe that such evil can't exist, especially not in the most ordinary seeming people. The 7 known victims of Nellie Mae Patterson deserve to be remembered not just as statistics in a sensational crime, but as individuals who had lives, dreams, hopes for the future. Thomas Webb, who worked double shifts to buy his wife small luxuries. Harold Patterson, who thought he had finally found someone to ease his loneliness. Raymond Clark, who ignored his daughter's warnings because he trusted his own judgment. And the others, whose stories have been largely lost to time, but who died in terror beneath the earth. Their deaths were not quick or merciful. They were prolonged and agonizing, filled with the ultimate horror of being conscious as darkness closed in, as air became scarce, as hope faded and panic set in. No one deserves to die that way. No one deserves to be buried alive, to spend their final moments in absolute terror, knowing that the person they trusted, the person they married, the person they shared their life with, had done this to them. If this journey through one of Kentucky's darkest mysteries has resonated with you, if you find yourself pondering the nature of evil and the masks it wears, then consider subscribing to this channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told, mysteries buried in time that deserve to be examined, truths that challenge our assumptions about human nature and the world we live in. Leave a like if this account provoked reflections that go beyond mere entertainment, if it made you think about trust and vulnerability and the darkness that can hide behind ordinary faces. And comment sharing your own perspectives on how communities can better protect potential victims, on how we can recognize warning signs before tragedy strikes, on lessons that can be learned from cases like this one. Until next time, remember that history's greatest horrors often wear the most unremarkable faces. Stay vigilant, trust your instincts, and never forget that the most dangerous predators are those who have learned to hide in plain sight.